Good evening. My name's Attorney Andrew Matthews, proudly the Vice Chairman of the National Law Enforcement Memorial and Museum, retired Connecticut State Police Sergeant, and currently I serve as the Executive Director for the National Troopers Coalition and the Connecticut State Police Union. We hope everyone is healthy and safe. Back in August, we opened our special exhibit, Post 9/11, the evolution of American law enforcement, not just as a reminder of the attacks 20 years ago, but also to consider their effects over the time. This week, we continued our post 9/11 program series to consider a major facet of the 9/11 reality, which is also an ongoing concern around the world in law enforcement, which is mental health and the response to traumatic events. So far this week, we've offered a series of honest, insightful, and moving interviews looking at hope coming out of the trauma of the 9/11 attacks. If you haven't seen them, you can find them on our website and social media channels. Tonight, we conclude our special week of programs with a panel discussion to focus on trauma grounded in the 9/11 experience, the realities of life since, and the steps taken for self-care and mental health. Before we begin, we want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us in this conversation tonight. We also want to thank our special sponsors for this evening's program, Central Square Technologies and Caron Treatment Centers. If this program is something you enjoy and you would like to help us continue our efforts to tell the stories of American law enforcement, please take 30 seconds to make a donation to the museum by texting programs 2021 to the number 41444. Again, programs 2021. The number is 41444. It takes just a moment and can really make a difference. And now for our welcoming remarks, I'm pleased to introduce to you Commissioner William Evans, who currently serves as the Executive Director and Chief of Police for the Public Safety Department at the Boston College. His career began in the Boston Police Department as a patrol officer back in 1982, rising through the ranks up to superintendent, and he served as superintendent from 2009 to 2013, and then proudly as the commissioner from 2014 to 2018. Commissioner Evans also serves as a board member for Central Square and has been a passionate voice for mental health. Commissioner, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Thanks, Andy, and appreciate everyone inviting me. 41 years in law enforcement, I think I realize how important it is as far as everybody's mental health and all the trauma that we witness in our job. As part of Central Square's ongoing commitment to support law enforcement community, we have partnered with the Law Enforcement Memorial and Museum to desensitize the conversation around mental health and law enforcement in our law enforcement community. Central Square has been active in raising awareness of the importance of mental health, especially around law enforcement, and they have resources available on their website at centralsquare.com. Every day we go out and we put our lives on the line to make our community safe. We are the front line of keeping our community safe, but with that comes a tremendous toll on the law enforcement community. I've witnessed firsthand officers over my career who have taken their lives because of the experiences and that they lived throughout their law enforcement career. I was very much involved in the Boston Marathon, where our officers on the front line had to witness the death in over 270 injuries. I remember how important their mental health was after that. I think law enforcement, obviously, as officers, we see things that no one sees. And I think it's great that now we're recognized that, we need these mental health services. We're not robots. We need the care. And Central Square is helping to bring those services here to our law enforcement community. In today's environment, given everything that's going on, our job has only got difficult. not only are we dealing with the trauma on the street, but also some of the sentiment that's out there. We do a great job every day. We put on our uniform, not knowing what's going to happen, but we do a tremendous job. And I have the utmost respect for this profession in my 41 years. So I want to thank, obviously, the National Law Enforcement Memorial and Museum for bringing us all together to talk about this important subject. And I wish that you all have a great discussion. We got some great panelists, and I know hopefully we can get a lot out of this that we can bring back to our respective police departments. So thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Commissioner. Be safe.
Thank you.
And now to introduce our moderator for tonight's discussion. Not only is he a close personal friend, Troy Anderson is the Executive Director of Law Enforcement Initiatives for the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial and Museum. He began his career in law enforcement more than 30 years ago as a U.S. Army military police officer and served in combat operations in the Middle East during Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. He eventually served as a Connecticut State Police Sergeant for 26 years, retiring as the Director of Wellness and Resilience. As the creator and program manager for STOPS, which stands for State Troopers Offering Peer Support program for 10 years, he managed several law enforcement related behavioral health programs, including the department's 2 CISM, Critical Incident Stress Management teams, one being the peer support program and the military support program. Following the tragic shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut in 2012, Troy managed the state police, the Connecticut State Police, CIS teams that were deployed on site and tasked with providing intervention and debriefings, not only for the affected members of the state police, the municipalities, and the federal law enforcement partners, first responder staff, support personnel, embedded clinicians, and state senior executives, but also for the families of Sandy Hook that lost loved ones. He has presented extensively on critical incident stress management and peer support across the United States, Canada, and Europe. And personally, I can attest that what his efforts and his knowledge had done for our troopers in Connecticut made a real difference. And I personally have witnessed him prevent suicides in law enforcement. So without further ado, Troy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Andy. I appreciate that. Such a kind introduction. I'd also like to thank Executive Director Thomas Canavan of the museum for putting on such a wonderful panel tonight for us and the events from the week. Without any further ado, I'm going to get right into our introductions of the panel. I'd like to begin with Cherie Castellano, Program Director of Cop to Cop in New Jersey, national expert in the field of peer support after 20 years of experience as the creator of the reciprocal peer support model, recognized as a national best practice by the American Psychiatric Association and the Department of Defense Center of Excellence. Following September 11th, Cherie coordinated a critical incident response to over 1,900 first responders in New York and New Jersey. Thank you for joining us, Cherie. Next, Dr. Peter Colleen, a former police officer with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey Police Department. Peter began his current role as a police psychotherapist with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey police unions in 1992. He was involved extensively with the rescue and recovery efforts following the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center, followed by years of trauma counseling provided to Port Authority first responders. Dr. Colleen recently co-authored 4 books for law enforcement professionals on ways to personally integrate mindfulness, resilience, and meditation into daily life in order to live a more sustainably healthy lifestyle. Thank you for joining us, Doctor. Next, Dr. Reverend Paul Krampitz, a Connecticut State Police chaplain since 2006. Paul is currently the pastor of Bethany Lutheran Church in Cromwell, Connecticut, a visiting lecturer at Yale Divinity School, and member of several local boards, including the Cromwell Restorative Justice Youth Diversion Board. Prior to ordination, Paul served in the United States Army as an airborne infantry officer. Following his military service, Paul attended the Connecticut Municipal Police Training Academy, where he was selected sergeant of the 193rd Training Class. Upon graduation, he served on the Cheshire Police Department as a patrol officer, detective, youth officer, and member of the SWAT team. Thank you, Reverend. Next, Jim Nestor is a consultant for the Center of Policing at Rutgers University and is developing a special program for first responders at Care and Treatment Center as a national model for trauma-centered and evidence-based treatment. Following 2 years in the U.S. Army, military police, he graduated from the Pennsylvania State Police Academy and served with a transit police agency in Philadelphia. He's been a certified police instructor at state police and county police academies for 25 years and is a licensed clinical addiction counselor and certified employee assistance professional. For 23 years, he was the director of the State of New Jersey Department of Law and Public Safety, Office of Employee and Organization Development. In this role, he led the Employee and Management Assistance Services for 9,500 employees, families, and the Office of Attorney General and the New Jersey State Police. Thank you for joining us. Captain Brandon Post is a senior research associate with the Institute for Intergovernmental Research. He serves as program lead for the National Suicide Awareness for Law Enforcement Officers Program, or SAFE-LEO, and he provides instruction on the topics of officer safety and wellness for the Valor Office Safety and Wellness Program. Captain Post retired from the Provo, Utah Police Department in 2021 after 20 years of service. He most recently served as commander of the Patrol Division. Prior to this assignment, he served as the commander of the Special Operations Division, supervising the department's major crimes, special enforcement, community-oriented police, and school resource officer teams. Thank you for joining us, Brandon. So those of us of a certain age can remember where we were on 9/11/2001 when we learned that our nation had come under attack, and more specifically, New York City. So many lives were lost that day, and still many more today due to 9/11 related illnesses. While we are going to be discussing tonight and having a very candid discussion about the traumatic events surrounding that day, I think it's also important for us to realize that much of the discussion that we're going to be having tonight relates to officers and law enforcement officers around the country today. So to get things started, I'd like to start with you, Jim. You were the one that conducted the one-on-one interviews that we all saw this week, and you were also at Ground Zero. You responded. What I'd like you to do is kind of set the tone, not only what your feelings were when you arrived at Ground Zero, but also what was your reaction as you were coming into contact with affected personnel at the scene? I think you're on mute, Jim. Sorry, Jim, you're on mute if you can't hear me there. Jim, you're on mute. Sorry about that.
Sorry about that.
Yeah,
Good,
yeah,
you didn't hear any of that.
Yeah,
Glad you didn't hear
all
that.
Thank you.
So what I usually start with when people ask me what it was like is the actual timing of it. That day on 9/11 in the morning, there was a conference in Atlantic City, New Jersey, where most of the executives and leadership of the East Coast were at that conference. And once people started whispering in ears, people started to move and get out. I mean, there were helicopters coming in to pick up people from the FBI in Washington, going up to New York, I think to Boston were there. I was told by my major in the state police to head up towards Jersey City. And I would say that the most eerie feeling was, as I traveled the New Jersey Turnpike many times, it was actually closed. There was no traffic on the New Jersey Turnpike. When I say no, even the state police were blocking off. There was not many vehicles at all, even from emergency management. It was an eerie feeling going over the bridge into Jersey City, where you actually saw by that time the plume of smoke, and yet still no traffic. Arriving at Jersey City at Liberty State Park, which is directly across the Hudson River from the World Trade Center, we began to just set up, because at that time, some of the New Jersey State Police were bringing in buses and troopers were responding. It was probably 11 o'clock. The second building had been down, somewhere around there. And I can just recall the people that were coming from New York City over into New Jersey in bus loads, in cars, covered in white soot, getting out with children and not really knowing what to do or where to go. And I guess for me, that was just the message that this is going to be something that you've never seen before. This is a new deal. Why don't you begin by just trying to set up in a position where if there's any emotional help that's needed for the first responders, I could help with them. And that was over at the Journal Square, they called towards Journal Square. And then we moved over into the Liberty State Park and began that setup. So I think it was just the that eerie feeling of A, no traffic whatsoever in New Jersey, and then B, seeing the massive smoke coming out of that area. When we certainly did get over into the zone towards ground zero, we would just go down, and basically by that time, it was in the afternoon, maybe 4 o'clock. It looked like it was 10 o'clock at night because there was no sunlight whatsoever. And it was just, it looked like someone could take a cutout picture of Hiroshima or Nagasaki and hand it to you, and you would have said, oh, I'm there. That was the massive destruction from it. So it was really just getting ready to set up with whatever was needed at that point. A lot of it was planning, waiting for urban search and rescue teams that were coming in from all across the country, and just then making my phone calls to see whom I needed to get together, that we were going to stay for a couple of weeks there.
Sure. Shuri, one of the things that struck me in your one-on-one interview that Jim had conducted with you earlier in the week was the enormity of the disaster, the size and scale. And even though you had had training in critical incident stress management through ICISF, you suddenly realized that this was on such a large scale that you hadn't been trained in this. And I don't know how anybody could be. And that's when you picked up the phone and called Dr. Jeffrey Mitchell and said, where do we go from here? Kind of walk me through not only what that was like for you, but how do you approach diffusings and debriefings on such a large scale? I just can't even imagine how many responding folks were at that scene.
Yeah, I think, well, it was Dr. George Everly, by the way, just for the record. Yeah, who I worked with for the last 20 years. But I think that, what's important for me to be honest about with this is that, no matter what initials we have after our names or training that I had at the time or research I had done in trauma, it just didn't mean anything at that moment. I was just completely overwhelmed. I was frightened. I was traumatized. I felt inept. It seemed like putting a Band-Aid on an amputation, no matter what I was trying to do. And I wanted to just be honest about that. I thought that it was really important to be honest about not acting as if I knew what to do. And so for me, because I had worked with Dr. Jim Reese from the FBI and Dr. Everly before on a very limited basis, I just out of desperation and sort of Jersey girl chutzpah, thought I'm going to ask for help because I don't know enough to really do what needs to be done. And especially the Port Authority Police, which I know, Dr. Colleen did such a superb job leading before, during, and after all this. I really wanted to be sensitive to the culture at Port Authority, to the magnitude of the loss, to the fact that so many leaders were missing. So people don't really understand that, before people were confirmed to be lost, they were missing. And so other people were acting in their positions. And so the trauma across the board from everybody that I was with and the people I was trying to help, the magnitude was so big that besides praying and calling the nation's best people, I literally took it minute by minute because it wasn't following any books I had read.
finding a way to do debriefings and the logistics of keeping track of who was at that scene and who needed to be scheduled to have those debriefings and the notifications of how and when those debriefings were to happen. I can only imagine what that must have been like for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really important to recognize that a lot of us wanted to do something, but it wasn't appropriate for the people who were suffering. So sort of putting my thoughts and needs about what they should get behind and listening to what they said they wanted at that moment seemed to be really important. And later on, when I was involved in testimony and getting funding, I kept talking about listening to the voice of the rescuer in a real disaster, not what you think you should give them. Because they will tell you, don't debrief me now, don't talk to me now, leave me alone, do something for my family, help somebody else. And I think it was really important to listen to them.
So the rules really go out the window at that point as to following, any sort of model as to how to do it. And you're really rewriting the rule book. Dr. Colleen, 20 years have passed, and how have intervention techniques advanced in the past 2 decades? And what do you see by way of resources and treatments that have changed that maybe didn't exist in 20 years ago?
Well, as Cherie said, anything you read in books or had no application at that particular time. It was just a calamity all over the place. And part of the issues were there were so many people, a deluge of people coming in from around the country who wanted to do some good and to help out, but there was no direction, and it just created a lot of chaos. Quite honestly, I think it did more harm than good, because I can only speak from the Port Authority's perspective that we have 13 facilities, Trade Center being one of them, so we were down to 12. And when the officers would get their break, they were forced to work 12 to 16 hours. They didn't want to go into the reserve rooms because they were going to be bombarded by people, chaplains, counselors, you name it. And they said, I don't want to go in there. I don't want to be asked, you should be feeling this, or, how are you feeling? You should be feeling this, you're feeling that. That wasn't the time for any of that at that point. We were just trying to figure out, because none of us have ever experienced something like that before. I know I hadn't, and I was, I'm the clinician for the Port Authority police, all the unions, and I never dealt with anything to that degree. So from that point, 20 years later, looking back and looking where we are today, we certainly have learned a great deal in terms of treatment, understanding what resiliency is, psychological trauma, post-traumatic growth, all of the terms and the terminology. And really, you have to take the individual where they're at that time, because you may experience trauma in a very different way than I do. And I have to understand, where you're coming from and the trauma that you're experiencing. Have we improved in terms of what we offer people? Absolutely. We've come a tremendous distance from where we were. And, when I teach in the academies, I tell individuals, said, look, you may be feeling good today, but if you've been exposed to trauma in the past and you're hit with a critical incident of some sort, it could bring you to your knees, and you're going to say, what the hell is going on? So I always go back to the thinking of education. The more we educate people, the more we destigmatize the mental health realm, and let officers or agents or whatever the case is in law enforcement component, let them know that it's not a weakness, but it's a way for a more sustainable lifestyle and a healthy lifestyle. And I think we're getting there. I think it's a slow movement, and I think we're getting there. I think we're making some headway. The one thing I was glad the commissioner was on, he's been around for a long time. As long as it's coming from above, from the executive board, that there's an implicit endorsement of getting the help that you need without retribution, you're moving in the right direction. If they're not on board, you could have the best program in the world, but it's not going to go anywhere. So
I'd like to bring Brandon in on that as somebody who is a police administrator as we talk about stigma. Doctor, thank you for bringing that into the conversation. Stigma is something that has been very prevalent in the culture of law enforcement, I would imagine since the beginning of time. And those of us who've been around for a while, we knew what it was like to come up in a time where they told you to rub a little dirt on it or suck it up and drive on. And I think that there's been a paradigm shift since then, and as to how training is, and also how police administrators. Brandon, can you talk from an administrator spot as a captain when you were in Provo? How was it looked at? Was it looked upon favorably for your officers, rank and file folks, to get help when they needed it? Because I think that there are still probably some pockets of this nation where there are agencies that are change adverse when it comes to accepting the fact that it's a sign of strength to get help as opposed to a sign of weakness.
No, but I couldn't agree with Dr. Colleen more. We have not been great at reaching out and asking for help, and we have also not traditionally been great at giving mental health to officers who do manage to express that courageous vulnerability to reach out. Mm-hmm. We are worlds better now. We still have a long way to go. We got work to do, but we are doing much better than we did before. You mentioned the stigma. I mean, one of the stigma is that mark of shame, and a big message we really wanted to send is you can't allow the things that haunt you or the really difficult things that you see and experience in this career, you can't allow them to become the unbearable burden that that can define you or define your career. A message that I think is really important, we need to continually send to smash this stigma, is that the brutal truth, and I know it's shocking to us in law enforcement, but the brutal truth is we're human beings. And I'd argue by virtue of what we do, what we experience, and the fact we even signed up for this job, we're extraordinarily resilient human beings, but still human beings. And this job exposes us to things that are outside the bounds of normal human experience. And it is normal human behavior to be bothered by some of the things we see and experience in this job. I mean, think about all of us who have been an officer for more than a few months have probably been on a difficult call with a child, or it's normal human behavior to have that bother you. In fact, we should probably get to the point where if somebody's on that call and it does bother, it should be more cause for concern than having it bother them. There's a lot of power that fellow officers, and you mentioned leadership, especially lead can set. If someone comes to them and expresses that they're struggling with something, listen to their concerns, processing it in a healthy way, having policies in place that encourage them to reach out and step forward and process these things is important. There's a lot of power there. It sends the right message to your organization. And I do want to be really clear here. When I say reaching out and asking for help, I am not saying that the individual is weak or that they can't handle this. I mean, the message here is, have you considered that you're worthy of a safe and unbiased, productive opportunity to process some of these difficult things that you've seen and experienced? Because as we all know, a healthy officer is a better and a safer officer.
That's valuable stuff. I think oftentimes society thinks that police officers have some genetic predisposition that makes them immune from going to bad calls and having to respond to things that other people should never have to see. And I think those of us who have been doing this for a period of time realize that we couldn't be further from the truth, Captain. You're right. We are human. And, to speak to that, Reverend Krempitz, can you talk about your role as a police chaplain and the importance of the spirituality component in disasters and trauma response?
Absolutely, Troy. We were side by side at Sandy Hook, and just, not being there as a first responder, but, as a support person, events like that strike you to your very core. And police chaplains deal with our spiritual dimension. And what is spirit? It's the part of us that can't be defined as either mind or body, but it's an important component of who we are. And body, mind, and spirit are all interconnected. So police chaplains help people become or strengthen their spiritual health, which doesn't necessarily have a religious component to it. For some people, being spiritually well means being religious, but spirituality is really about how do you find hope and meaning in the midst of these devastating events? How do you go on? How do you integrate this experience? And for some, religion is helpful, but for others, other sorts of rituals, daily routine, connection with family and friends, physical activity, et cetera. So I think it's important to remember that we have this other dimension to who we are, this spiritual dimension, and that needs to be attended to just as much as our emotional or mental well-being, and also our physical well-being too. So, police chaplains ought to be, talking about meditation as much as they are about going to church.
Mm-hmm. It's really about restoring that balance in the end.
It absolutely is. And I'm really glad that we started with 9/11, because that was, an attack and insult to the very heart of our nation. And all of these critical incidents are an insult or an attack on the core of our being. And for those of us, who are into physical fitness, you have to have core strength in order to be healthy, right? If you have a weak core, the rest of your body is not going to function properly. Core is also related to the French word for heart, which, in the ancient mind was the seat of emotions and all these other things. So it's heart health, but not in the cardiac sense. It's about the core of our being and being strong there. And when we're strong physically, emotionally, and spiritually, we're more resilient.
I recall back, Reverend, when you and I were doing a number of debriefings related to Sandy Hook, and listening to some of the troopers and the officers that were in those debriefings, and them just sharing their experiences, and you being able to process them in a way that nobody else really could process that, right? So if a clinician couldn't process that, or somebody who had been trained, an officer who had been trained in CISM, when people were talking about how things were unholy, or if there was a God, how could this have happened? And I can only imagine that in 9/11, those debriefings they were hearing the exact same things, and maybe even on a grander scale. But I think the importance can't be underscored enough of the chaplaincy program, and having that as an integrated component into police agencies. And I still find it shocking today when I talk to agencies around the country and I say, who's your chaplain? And they say, we don't have one. And I think, well, then you should go get one today. You should go find one today, one that'll work and integrate into, a law enforcement friendly type of person. And it's so important to have that early on, right? I think about how many people in law enforcement, one of the worst things that we have to do is make death notifications. And anybody who's worn a uniform for any period of time has had to do that. And it's a pretty awful thing to knock on the door in the middle of the night and tell somebody that their son or daughter or husband or wife isn't coming home. And I remember the times when I've had a chaplain who has been able to go out with troopers who work for me, or has been able to go out and what a difference it makes to help be able to process that, not just for the affected person who's getting that horrific news, but for the officer as well, because I find that after that call is over, the officer and the chaplain, or trooper and the chaplain are talking it over somewhere over a cup of coffee. And I think that's the healthiest thing to do is be able to talk it and process it and normalize that effect. And I think, very often that's the reason why we look at the firefighter profession as so healthy. I think that's because they go back to the firehouse after they're done with their call, and they kind of talk about it over whatever they do there, rolling hoses and feeding their Dalmatian, right? I'm not sure what they do, but I think that they're healthy for that reason. They go and they spend the time and they process that. And I think law enforcement officers, it's difficult when you get in a car and you go drive, kind of from call to call. Brandon, I wanted to ask you a question. sadly, I think it's difficult to talk about post-traumatic stress injuries in law enforcement and not have the concept or the thought of suicide be brought into the discussion. I'd like you to talk a little bit about Safe Leo and the work that you're doing. And and I've heard you say sort of this a couple times, and I think it's great that you keep saying it. And that is basically that the concept of it's okay not to be okay. Can you talk a little bit about what Safe Leo is doing and how they help?
No, absolutely. So the Safe Leo mission is to heighten the awareness of the problem of suicide in law enforcement and prevent officer deaths by suicide. I mean, we know that every year we lose more officers to suicide than we do to assaults and on-duty traffic accidents combined. And that fact alone should mandate a call to action on the part of our profession. So the Safe Leo program believes that to conflict with suicide, agencies must prioritize wellness, mental wellness training, and officer wellness with the same degree of attention that we give our tactical training. Mm-hmm. We believe this goes beyond just an agency responsibility. It is all of our responsibility. Like I said it before, but it's one of the ongoing beliefs we have is that a healthy officer is a better and safer officer. Because when a human being gets help and treatment for things they are struggling, then they have deeper reservoirs to deal with other human beings who are struggling, and they're able to be kinder, more patient, more delicate, we would say. So it's obviously important in law enforcement. Basically, our program, it's completely funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, meaning that every resource, training and technical assistance, all of our online, everything we provide is provided at no cost to the agency. It's all grant funded by the BJA. So
that's great stuff. It's really a difficult topic. I know that it's tough to talk about it, but I can only imagine how many suicides stemmed from responders and survivors related to 9/11. I can only imagine, and I'm certain that there are records kept. But it's tough to think that any of our brothers and sisters in uniform have had to get to a point where they suffer in silence to that extent. And I really thank you and all the folks, Nick Brule as well, and Safe Leo, and all the work that you're doing to bring awareness to it, and to shine a little bit of light on something that I think for many years has been a little dark secret in law enforcement. We don't really talk about it until it happens, and then even when it happens, we don't know how to talk about it. And it's good that so many professionals like you folks on the panel are in a position where you're finding ways to help people through these stressful events. Dr. Colleen and Cherie both, I'd like you both to talk to kind of the long-term psychological impact that traumatic events like 9/11 have on a police agency. And I think you can both speak to that. So it's kind of a two-part thing that I'd like to ask. Number one, what's the long-term impact? And number two, what can agencies do to prepare for the inevitable if it ever were to happen again?
Cherie, you want to start?
Sure. I think a couple of things. It's kind of a loaded question, but I guess I want to sort of just raise the issue that in addition to suicide loss post 9/11, there was another kind of loss. Hundreds, if not thousands of wives and husbands and family members telling us in the 9/11 first responder lines and the Port Authority line and cop to cop, my husband wasn't killed on that day, but he's gone, right? So there's a lot of ways to lose people. And so, we did track and do some research with Dr. Violante on outcomes following 9/11 related to the impact of officer stress and suicide risk and increased volume when there were those red and yellow alerts. I don't know if you remember all of that, and just having everybody try to get used to that new normal phrase. But I think when your question about the impact on the organization, I think in many ways, at least in terms of Port Authority, the people who remained closer than ever. It wasn't a trauma bond like in a negative way. I think there was a sense of, in that agency, a closeness and a survival and again, Dr. Colleen can speak to this much better than me, but I was involved for 7 years with just trying to provide support. And, we had to do things that were atypical. We created a crisis management briefing to bring the most affected officers for 3 days to a site confidentially and engage their families. We had to be creative. We had to find funding. But I think that their resilience it stood alone amongst each other. And so I'll talk about peer support, for days. That's my passion and the devotion of my work. But I think that the Port Authority officers helped each other more than any of us did. And I think that fostering that, brotherhood, letting people get back to their core values, allowing pride and recognition for the agency and the organizational, rising and overcoming suffering is really important. And I think that is connected to unbelievable strong leadership. I think now, 20 years later, I'm not in touch. I would defer to Dr. Colleen on that. I do know from spending 20 something years at Cop to Cop, officers are more willing to get help. People who have been through 9/11 have a look and a phrase and don't have to say much to each other, and we're instantly connected if you live through that. But I think that an agency like Port Authority stands alone. I mean, I think FDNY, I think NYPD, I think a lot of groups did. But I think that Port Authority specifically, which I was most involved with, just taught me a lot about overcoming suffering and became a model and an agency that everyone looked up to. But I do love the idea of promoting peer support, promoting prevention and intervention before we're dealing with postvention. I think you need to embed all that. I think you need to keep the people out who don't know the culture and don't know the population and don't have the expertise, and only put the best people with the best rescuers to be there before, during, and after, and stay there. We stayed for 7 years, and Dr. Colleen has stayed throughout. So I'll pass it to you, Peter. At this
point.
I
appreciate you touching, Cherie, on that real collateral damage that happens in the aftermath of a traumatic or critical incident. I know that we saw that as well in Sandy Hook, and unfortunately, relationships lost, and folks that didn't take care of themselves properly. Unfortunately, some health issues that came up along the way, substance abuse issues, some really unfortunate coping mechanisms. So I think it's great that these programs are out there, but I don't think we can ever do enough. Dr. Colleen, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, what Cherie had to say was right on the money, and I can only speak from my own personal experience of what it was like. There are a couple of components here. One being that there are very few people left on the job now who were at 9/11. Most of them have retired, went out on disability. There are still a few still there. And what I tell them is what's most important is the new officers coming onto the job, they have to be educated as to what 9/11 was and what it was for Port Authority. We have quite a history. We lost the 37 that day. It was a substantial amount of people we lost. We lost top management. So we were running around like chickens with our heads cut off because we didn't know who was taking charge, who was controlling the situation. It was a disaster. It was a disaster that followed a disaster. So it took us a while to get grounded in what needed to be done. And going into it from the mental health perspective, and this goes out to all mental health clinicians, and I think many of you would agree with me that, we're so good at taking care of other people that we forget to take care of ourselves. And I remember spouses saying to me, how are you doing? I said, great, everything's good. Until I hit about the 3rd or 4th year mark, and I was not doing good. I was imploding. I'm on call. I was not answering calls. I'd lose my patience, lose my temper for no reason at all. I'd watch a commercial on TV and get very sad and tear up. It was ridiculous. And I'm saying, what the hell is going on? So I had taken care of enough cops, making sure that they got to see doctors, got on medication and everything. And I said, I have to get myself to a doctor. And that's what I did. I got into the Mount Sinai program. And the social worker said, well, you fall on the spectrum of PTSD. I knew I had vicarious trauma. And she said, what would you like? I said, I'd like to be put on medication. And she started laughing. She goes, nobody's ever told me that. I said, well, so many other people I've helped. That's what happened. I made sure that they were taken care of. So from my perspective, one of the things that I learned from it, and I think it's a good lesson to learn, you're not impervious. You're one person, you're absorbing everybody else's pain and sadness. And it did a job on me. And to this day, 20 years later, I still have my moments when I go in and out and the burnout comes right over me. And, being on medication, I stop the medication, comes back. It's the way of the world and what we're dealing with today with the trauma. So going back to where we were, where we are now, and I tell the recruits and the new people, even when I was training down in the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, so look, it's not shameful. And one of the directors from the agency said, we want you healthy from the head up, not just from the neck down, from the neck up, not just from the neck down. And he was so right. And again, he was endorsing getting mental health counseling. He was in support of that. And I think the more we talk about it and we let people know that it's okay. I'm not sure who just said that. I apologize, but it's okay that you're not 100%. Get the help that you need, And going back to Sheree, what she said is getting people in there who are law enforcement competent, who understand the culture, and who can do the job. They're not there, enthralled by the stories, but they can zero in on where they are. We have a ways to go still, and I understand that. But again, we've learned from our mistakes, I hope, and we'll continue to make mistakes along the way. But we're learning a lot more today, and from a institution, even the institution, Ed Setnar was on last night and sharing his experience with illness as a result of 9/11. That's what needs to take place. People need to share their stories of, I tell people I was a mess. I helped a lot of people, I think, but I was damaged along the way from that. And thankfully I came out on the other side somewhat intact, probably not far from 100%, but somewhat intact. And I hope that I can continue to do my work. But, when you have people like Superintendent Setnar and, Teresa, who shared her story of losing her brother, who I knew, and they talked about hope. And if we don't have hope in law enforcement and in our work, then we might as well pack up and go home, because we'll never get anywhere from that point. So that's my.
Thank you, Doctor, for sharing that. It seems like we're getting so many things right. And I think about the indoctrination into law enforcement when people enter recruit or academy training. And I think about all the things that they teach you there. And of course, I've been to a couple of police academies at this point in my life, but the toughest one I would say was probably the Connecticut State Police. And, I could make a bed and I could shine my shoes and do a lot of push-ups. But, I don't remember all those years ago, them really spending a whole lot of time talking about the psychological health, those universal and predictable signs and symptoms of post-traumatic stress. They'd say you're going to go to a fatal call or you might go to a SIDS death, but what can we do? What can we do to prepare people coming into this line of work for the things that they're going to see? What do we teach people in the academy? And how do we teach it in the academy in such a way that it's digestible for people that come in who are, ready to run 5 miles and get sprayed with pepper spray and tasers and all those things? Sometimes it's tough to parse that out when you're sending the message of we've got to be really tough and resilient physically, but there's a real psychological component to this too. And I think that it starts, and it should start, on the day you walk through that door. That should be a real big piece. Does anybody want to talk about that?
Yeah, Troy, can I just take a second and jump in on that one? So, some of one of the people who taught me about law enforcement training was Jim Nestor, who's on this panel. But in New Jersey in 2009, our governor did a deep dive into an increase in suicides in our state. And we're the only state in the country with legislation for the Cop to Cop program, which is suicide prevention and peer support. But they decided to legislate our state to be the first state in the country to mandate that every single police recruit, as part of the Police Training Commission, has to do a mandatory block on suicide prevention. And at the time that we developed the course back in 2009, I was one of the people involved in the task force. It was pretty good, but it wasn't that robust. It was a little bit more about the suicide and the statistics than it was about what you as a recruit might experience. So we were blessed this past year to have the opportunity to rewrite the course. And we brought together the resiliency program with our Attorney General and the UPenn model. We brought prevention, intervention, and postvention, and we're launching it in January 2022. So every law enforcement officer in the state of New Jersey is going to get this new revised course about how to do QPR and be their brother's keeper and be gatekeepers, and how to look at resilience and prevention, that you don't go from zero to suicidal, that you need to, from the beginning of your career, understand the cycles, understand your values, and understand your resilience. So we're really excited about it. So just wanted to mention.
By you bringing that up, you realize now that everybody's going to be reaching out to you tomorrow for everything that you're doing. So anyway, that's just the way these things work. You know, Jim, somebody put something in the chat box as far as a question, and I was going to wait until the end, but I know you spent so much time working with the Jersey State Police, and you know, one of the things that we've seen over the years now is some agencies making it mandatory that you have to go through some level of, and I've heard it explained as a checkup from the neck up, but going in on a yearly basis, making it mandatory that you have to go in and at least check in with a clinician. It doesn't mean that you have to sit down and have a really big in-depth discussion, but you have to go in on a yearly or whatever the scheduled basis is and go in. Do you have any experience with that, Jim? You're on mute again. Mute. There you go.
Yeah, I would reference going back to 9/11. Where that really starts, Troy, is with some policy. If you have a policy that mandates anything, no one can whine about the policy. Everybody has to do it. I was lucky enough to have a colonel for 14 years in the state police, Rick Fuentes, that was on a street gang unit for 15 years before he became the colonel. He'd been involved in 2 shootings. It was mandated for him to come see us. So of course, when he was colonel and anybody complained, I would just say, well, go talk to the colonel, because the colonel went through this process too. And I think that's important because it takes that stigma out of everyone that you make the choice. By mandate, again, the policy has to be written in a manner that's fair to everyone. And that expanded, just that one incident with the shootings involved in a critical incident to that nature, that did expand to what are we doing for the detective units that are on child pornography? What are we doing with the recruits that are coming in and going out to different areas? Or what are we doing with traffic accident investigations, homicides? We had a major crimes unit that did somewhere around 400 homicides a year. And it was funny because we had once mentioned to the colonel, we're going to do some training for CIS. And he said, how many people do you want, Jim? And I said, Colonel, I'd like to have 2,800. And he started to laugh. He said, you mean the whole division? And I said, Colonel, that's how important it is, that not just 90 people of the 2,800 should know about these issues, all 2,800 should. So we did look at those issues, writing some policy. And I learned from a guy that was big in NIJ and was an administrator for the Department of Law and Public Safety, the Attorney General's office for, 35 years, 8 governors. And he used to say, Jim, all the actions that I see you putting together are phenomenal. We love them. But if you don't memorialize them with policy, they're worthless.
Right.
So I think
that conversation really needs to be also between the leadership. It has to be buy-in from the rank and file. And in states that are collective bargaining unit states, the unions as well, because they know that whenever anything becomes mandatory, you'd have to sit at the table and talk about that. But I think that you would hope that everybody that would sit down at the table would realize that the end result is for the men and women that are out there wearing the uniform every day to get that baseline, to find out where they are when they're early on the job. So when they're going in to get checked in later, and things are just not quite adding up. And you're right, it does. It takes away that stigma. It normalizes when you go in and have that opportunity to sit down. We did that for some of our folks in computer crimes who are seeing some pretty awful things, and we kind of made that something that they would have to do on an ongoing basis. And they thanked us for that. They thanked us in the end because they realized that that was done for them. And in the end, it was also done for their families. It was done for the agency. It was done for the good of the order, as they say. Brandon, as a police administrator, what are agencies doing now? When you look at best practices and and things like maybe making it mandatory to get a checkup from the neck up. Do you have any experience with that where you are, or making it mandatory that you would have to go to a debriefing or anything like that? Is that something you experienced out in your department?
Yeah, so part of what I was in charge of when I was with Provo was helping build, along with we had a committee that was doing it, was helping build our wellness program. And I've kind of changed my opinion on the mandatory portion of we turned it a wellness visit rather than a checkup because we figured that words are important. I tried to put together a book club in the police department. Nobody showed up. And then I changed it to leadership training, and suddenly I had people showing up for it. So how you term it is important to how people view it. So we called it a wellness visit rather than a checkup. But initially, I didn't like the mandatory portion of it because I thought that if we make it mandatory, then there has to be a penalty ascribed to it if you don't do it. And I didn't want any kind of negative stigma attached to it. I wanted it to be a beneficial thing. But then going through it, I had the realization, we do firearms. I was lucky enough to be on SWAT for 15 years. We had to do a firearms qual 6 times a year, and I still enjoyed shooting at that, and it was mandatory. We all have we have our mandatory PT test, we have our mandatory firearms, and it just becomes part of our culture. We accept that we have to do it. We're going to do it, and everyone does it, from commissioner, chief, down to the newest recruit. So I transitioned. I really believe it should be mandatory. It needs to be. It's just part of our culture. It's something we do, and it's something you mentioned. Getting in early so you get baseline data on people of where they're at when they're new in the career, that is invaluable. So then you can track and go back on that data to see how people are doing and measure and adjust and provide necessary resources and have people come in and talk to them about what you're seeing and the changes. There's just so much value to it, and it becomes part of the culture, which I think is absolutely what we need to do to eradicate this stigma against help seeking.
You bet. I can recall after Sandy Hook, we came up against this period where we were trying to get everybody to voluntarily go to the debriefings, but there were some people that were reticent in coming to debriefings for whatever reason. And usually it wasn't for the right reason, but they didn't want to come to these debriefings. So we had those discussions about making it mandatory that you go, but what you don't want is a room full of hostages and people that don't want to be in there, right? So you can imagine how that would be. I think that it's sad that that we didn't make it mandatory to some extent because there were some folks that voluntarily decided not to be a part of that. And I know some agencies do make it mandatory. You must go to a debriefing. You don't have to participate, even if you just sit in the room. Maybe by the mere fact that you're there, you're going to start to pick things up and maybe be able to help yourself out a little bit and hopefully participate. But, one of the things as we sort of are nearing our time together, I look at this group and I think about the wealth of knowledge and years of experience. And I think if there is somebody who's watching this right now, and I know that there is, who is either an affected person who is going through a very difficult time, maybe somebody who's affected with a post-traumatic stress injury, or a coworker of somebody, or a spouse or a significant other, or a child of somebody who they know is really wrestling with this. What can they do tomorrow? What can they do tomorrow to say, maybe I went through a 9/11, maybe I went through a Sandy Hook, maybe I was involved in a deadly use of force event, maybe it was just a really bad wreck that I went to, or a SIDS death when I had a child at home. But I've been carrying this. I've been compartmentalizing this stuff for too long, and I'm not effective. I'm not my best me right now. What can they do tomorrow to turn this around in their world, because you folks are the experts on what's available. Whoever wants to start, I'd love to hear from you. I'm gonna have to call on somebody.
2
I
words.
can jump in on that.
I was just going to say 2 words. Call Cherie.
Yeah, I think Cherie's going to be getting a lot of calls tomorrow anyway. Her phone's going to be blowing up. What do you have, Brandon?
I was just going to say, I think we need to get a point where we have a basic understanding. We've talked a lot about resilience and resiliency. I think we need to get a point where we have a basic understanding of resilience. So we mentioned 9/11. And the purpose of the people who planned 9/11 was to destroy and cause pain and anguish and hurt our nation. And we lost thousands of good people. And it was a difficult time for our nation. But if you look at the impact, millions of Americans developed resilience from that situation. Having post-traumatic symptoms does not mean you're not resilient. Resilience is not the absence of stress. Resilience doesn't mean you're not going to experience difficulty or distress. That we build resilience when we overcome something that is difficult and challenging. And in law enforcement, we constantly go to things that are difficult and challenging. We have extraordinary opportunities to build resilience, because resilience is not something that you have or don't have. It's not something you're born with. Just like a muscle, resilience can be built. And I just think it's important to let our people know, because I think we're a competitive lot. We may have, I look at other people and when I was struggling in my career and thought, well, I haven't been in a shooting like this individual. Why does it seem like I'm struggling and he's not? It's not this individual competition. That we can have these extraordinarily difficult events, but there can also be the cumulative impact of call after call after call and vicarious trauma that we can end up struggling with. And I think when we start to have that basic understanding of resilience, and there isn't something wrong with you if you're struggling, that it's okay to not be okay, you can still have resilience while experiencing these issues. I think that helps encourage us and get us further along where we need to go.
Dr. Colleen, you have anything you want to add to that?
It's a tough question because everybody's different and everybody's mindset is very different. And I just, if I may use an example, one of the books that I wrote was the 21-day call to action coin challenge. And I wanted something to be able to engage. This was for the academies. So I had the academies select 12 people, a random population. And I would meet with them once a week for 3 weeks, and it would be physical, psychological, and spiritual. And one of the things that they had to do every day was do a random act of kindness for someone. And I gave them 40 examples. They didn't have to think too hard. So I gave them the examples and they had to make it, keep it in the book. I gave them a thought for the day. It was all right there. And every week we would meet and I would ask them how they did. And they ended up loving the random act of kindness. And my thinking on that was the theory, I can't prove anything, but my thinking is that after into the second week, going into the third week, the brain begins to change. The chemistry in the brain begins to change and starts eliciting the positive hormones. And I'm thinking, if a cop is feeling better about themselves, the likelihood of them doing harm to themselves is diminished exponentially. And so when I did the evaluation for the class, for the 12 recruits, they all said that was a random act of kindness, that every recruit should get that. And that's what I was looking for. I wanted to see if they were receptive to it. And in there, I also trained them with 3, going back to an earlier discussion with spirituality, meditation. I gave them 3 samples of different meditations, and we did the meditation. So I think we have to start working with them. They're, in Jersey with the resiliency program they're going to launch in 2022. It has to be about engagement. It can't just be talk. You have to bring them in, especially the younger people today. They don't want to just be talked to, right? Mm-hmm. So we need to be more interconnected with them and have them do the work as well. And I think the more engaged they are, the better it will be.
Right.
It's new territory for all of us, really,
Maria, I used to get a lot of phone calls from spouses and significant others saying that their loved one was just pushing back when they knew that they needed to get them some help. What are you saying to these spouses? What are you saying to these loved ones when the person that means most to them in the world happens to be a law enforcement officer and they just simply don't want to get help? What do you tell them?
Yeah, well, I'm so proud. I'm married to a lieutenant. My husband is with the Morris County Prosecutor's Office, so I am a law enforcement spouse. I always say that's my proudest title. I think, a couple of things to answer your question, not just related to the spouses, but anybody who loves a law enforcement officer. I think I say, if you want to understand resilience, just look in the mirror. I think this idea of post-traumatic growth tells us what? Sense of self, spirituality, and family strength. If you get those three things together and you focus on those three things, you're going to be able to thrive, not just survive your career and exposure to vicarious and secondary trauma. So I think knowing that you're not alone, how common it is. I think for police wives, there needs to be a whole bunch more, and police families, a whole bunch more training and engagement so that, law enforcement agencies have their own family. And then we police families are sort of over here and, we need to integrate those. But I don't think the issue is officers not wanting to get help. I think it's that they will talk to other officers. They will get help from appropriate, well-trained professionals. They are more in touch, more educated, and more willing to be open. Right now, morale is low because they don't feel like the world appreciates their work and their core mission to serve isn't being valued the way it was during 9/11. So I actually think officers seem more depressed now in some of the surveys we've done than they did post 9/11, which is really interesting because of what's happening in this country. But I think, the message is you're not alone. Cling to that family, cling to that faith, and cling to that understanding of your own self-awareness.
Fantastic advice, Sheree. Thank you. Reverend Krampitz, there's police administrators out there listening right now. There's people who are going through tough times right now. Why should they reach out to their chaplain, and how do they do that?
Well, chaplains are used to responding to situations that raise unanswerable questions, because, the ultimate meaning, the liminal spaces in our lives. And then to be able to say that, gee, I don't know why this happened, but it did. And together we can get through it. The physical and the emotional, mental health is all very important, but that spiritual component is just as vital, and they're all interconnected. So a department that doesn't have a chaplaincy program is really doing a disservice to its officers, and I would urge them to start one. And there are plenty of people around who would be willing to help, make that happen.
Thank you. I think there's a saying that the Vietnam generation sort of adopted, and that is that we know too much to get it wrong this time. And I think that in this conversation that we've all had tonight, as we wrap this up, I just think about the sage wisdom that you've all shared, and I appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules to come and share that, and really extend a piece of yourself out to the men and women who wear a uniform across this country, who are doing amazing work every day, and not during an easy time to do it, I might add. And I will also say that as I look in the Q&A piece, Sheree, it seems that people want to know more about your program already. So I said tomorrow, it seems that it's starting tonight. So, that's going to keep you busy. We'll have to find a way to put everybody in touch with you. So I'm not sure how we're going to do that, but we'll find a way to do it. Folks, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to do this tonight. It was informative to me, and this is something that I do on a regular basis. But it's just so refreshing to know that there's so many good people out there like you that are in a support capacity to help people get through their careers, and hopefully long after their career they can live into retirement and collect a retirement check. I hope those still exist, but they can have those for a long time and be mentally and physically well for their families and for themselves. And I don't think we can ask for much more than that. So I just want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. And I'd like to thank the National Law Enforcement Officer Memorial Museum for putting this together. So much fantastic information is coming out of there, and I encourage you to look at our website and keep up on what we're doing. And I'd just like to thank so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Troy. Honored to be with all of you.
Thank you.
That was a great conversation. You could tell you all have made a real difference in the men and women's lives that wear the uniform. I want to thank the panelists, the leaders in the field, Troy Anderson, for helping us navigate what can be a challenging but essential conversation. Once again, we thank each of you for attending, those that have attended tonight. We thank again to our sponsors for this evening's program, Central Square and Caron Treatment Centers. We'd also like to recognize our corporate sponsors who have supported the special exhibition of the 9/11 and the evolution of American law enforcement, specifically the Police Unity Tour, Goodyear, the Fraternal Order of Police, Bio One Incorporated, Thomson Reuters, 511 Tactical, Adam Rose and Peter McQuinn, and Production Solutions, and Grant Mail Direct Marketing Ltd. Our programs are made possible by our corporate partnerships and by individuals like you. If you would like to support us with a donation, please go to lawenforcementmuseum.org. Be sure to look for our past museum programs on our website and social media channels, including post 9/11 series of conversations. And don't forget, our museum is now open Fridays through Sundays each week. Come visit the museum in person and spend more time at the post 9/11 exhibition, where you can learn more about how law enforcement has evolved and responded in the 20 years since the 9/11 attacks. We look forward to you coming back to the museum, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope everyone is healthy and safe. Be safe.